is our sound doing today? Sound and fury. Right, settings look good. Perfect. Hello, everyone. New board game design day. Ooh, I should turn on my other light that I have here. So I got a new front light for my stream. Hopefully the lighting is going to be a little more consistent now. Because before I was adjusting the curtains and it would be very light or dark depending on what the sunlight situation was like. So new light, very excited. With or without plan. Okay, time for game making. Game thinking. Welcome back, Senior Bob. Always great to have you. Yeah, let's do it. So we've had some fun stuff recently on the games that we've been making. Let's just bring up last week's document real quick. Yeah, so last week we had some very cool ideas around, so Bobicus actually came in here and issued a challenge to make a sort of PvE asymmetric goals game. From that, so we started with more mechanics than theme is what we usually start with here to make our designs. Went from there, eventually got into a investing type of a game, a startup game. So you're getting investments from your participation in the startup, cooperative, competitive sort of a game, where you're trying to build up the company, but in the end being the person with the most stock. So Amoogsoft was the name of our fictional company. I think that was pretty funny. Yeah, so last week we had some fun times. Here we are this week with our blank page. This is your first time tuning in. We are here to design a board game. Obviously, making a game takes a lot of time to create the whole thing. So what we're doing here on the stream is, as you can see, we've got our blank page over here. We're starting from scratch without any sort of direction. Sometimes someone will want to build something around a mechanic. Sometimes we'll do a mind map and get a theme out of that. And yeah, just go from there. So let it flow, let it ride, and see where we end up. Senior Bob asks, is it one of those umbrella lights? I'm like, I could turn my cameras around and show it and probably ruin everything. Or I could just go in my order history on Amazon and link to that so you can see. It's actually a selfie ring. So yeah, I'm using a thing called a selfie ring right now for the lighting. So that's fun. I want to, maybe when I'm done, I'll take a picture of my setup because I finally cleaned things up a little bit here so I can show off the evolving collection of lights and cameras and mics I have here. So it's the circle ring that I'm using for lighting. We had a big one when I streamed and casted the Mox Gauntlet a couple of weeks ago, and it was right there in front of the casting booth. Give a really good lighting to it, so this one is fun, and I'll be able to take it with me. It's fairly transportable. I can plug it into a laptop or a battery, which is super convenient. Which is pertinent especially because I'll be traveling next week on Tuesday. I'm headed to Origins for the first time. Super excited about that. I'm actually flying. I think I'll be on a plane during the time when I'd normally be streaming. Still going to try and squeeze in something during this time slot. Hopefully be able to with the portability of my system, testing out a couple of things like the IRL streaming to see if I can still have a stream going on. But yeah, I'm here this week. Okay, so we've had this pen, I'm going to put this down here, since the beginning, pretty much the beginning of this stream, I think a couple of months now. I don't know if you've noticed while I've been streaming, but I take off both ends of the caps because they have different tips on them. And most of the time I'd take off this one and I'd want the other one, so I'd start with that. I actually just realized, if I can hold this up to the camera here, there's a symbol on each end showing, I don't think it's going to come in focus, you can't really see that. But there's a symbol showing which tip is on which side, so I just learned something today. Today's going to be a good day because I just figured out the symbology on my Copic marker. And now I'll have that information with me for all time. If no one else has a word to start with, that makes me think of symbols and symbology. I don't think that we've started with that for a mind map, if my memory serves me, but I think that's a good place to start. Symbols in board game design are very important, and they can be a very powerful design tool. We've been talking on Twitter recently about UI, UX of board game design and design, visual design as opposed to mechanical design for a game, and how much visual design you need in early prototypes. I think that I can actually bring up my Merge Elementals card. Maybe switch over here. Design. Yeah, there we go. So we're gonna do the mind mapping for symbology, but I want to touch real quick on this idea of symbols and UI on prototypes and board game design in general. So often you'll have cards or boards or other components. You'll probably have a lot of writing on the cards, especially if you're making a more technical game. Anything like a deck builder, a lot of the games that I usually make often have a fair amount of text on them. But there's definitely ways that you can make these cards and these components more understandable and less understandable. So for this card specifically, I have in the lower right corner a crystal to kind of signify this is going to be the art on the card. It might go behind the text, not final in any sort of a way. Once again, I get these art images from Noun Project. I have a subscription there, so I can use the pictures in an unlimited way. It makes me put a little bit of flavor on the cards without having to do a ton of work. And then you can't really see it on the screen here, but in the upper right corner next to the word I actually have that symbol as well. The idea behind these cards is that they lay on top of each other where these lines go. So when the cards are stacked, you actually can't see this picture in the lower right corner. And one of the first feedback I got from testing this is, oh, I can't see the picture, so it's hard to know what merges into what, because this is the merge game that I've been working on. And up in the upper left corner, you can see the picture of the salt and the icicles here. I haven't actually written that out to say that this card needs at least one salt and one icicle card to merge into it. But having the symbology here really makes it's a shorthand for communicating that information without having to put a ton of text, because there's already a lot of text. There's multiple abilities on this card. There's the name of the card, the tier of the card, and also the way in which this is laid out. You can use simple formatting like bold, font size, where on the card you put the information to make it very clear the information that you're trying to communicate. And of course all this is going to be changed as the game evolves. If you're working with a publisher, they're most likely to make the final visual design of your game. But even for playtesting, it can be great to use a little bit of symbology to communicate what the information you're trying to get across, because you can shortcut a lot of playtesting issues, answer a lot of questions with good symbology, save a lot of time, I think, is the good part, as opposed to having to repeat a lot of information. So I'm going to put UI here. UI isn't just symbology. I mean, there's a lot of layout and things that go into it. The symbols can be a big part of that. With or without plan says, is that a sign of what type of game to make? Something with symbol matching. It could potentially be symbol matching. So this is our mind map. The idea behind this is we're going to start with this concept, throw down a lot of ideas, make a web of ideas so things spawn out of each other, and try and come up with some more original ideas from using this creative brainstorming technique than just latching onto the first thing that we think of. Welcome back, game biologist. My first project was a symbol palooza because my target audience was so young. Playtesting was a combo of does the game work and do these symbols read clearly? I got the link there. What in the wild? Ooh. Yeah, definitely recommend clicking on Game Biologist's link here because that's got some really cool stuff, ideas of symbology. Text free. This is an interesting concept in game design as well, that you can actually make games, first of all, that don't need translation, which is pretty cool, that are not language dependent and that are not reading dependent. So like Game Biologist mentioned, working with kids potentially who might have not have the skills to read the cards yet, you can make games, you can communicate a lot of concepts with the symbols without words for people who might not be able to read them. With or without plan, I was just realizing the Copic pen images was a prophecy. I'm going to put prophecy in here. It's not directly related to symbology, but I like that. I want to see where that goes. Prophecy of pens. Senior Bob says, I have symbol matching in a fish game of mine. Matching collection. I'm going to put that down here. It's also symbols, symbology, matching. It's a very visceral type of a game mechanic. We didn't play around too much with my Haba components last week, so I'm just going to break out a few of these here. As I mentioned last week, I don't think they have any kits left, but about once a year, Haba will do a design contest. You'll be able to purchase a design kit with a bunch of their components. And they were saying on Twitter they actually just scoop a huge bucket of components and put it into each of their packages, which is super cool. And I got all sorts of fun pieces here. So when we're talking about symbols and symbol matching, a lot of components that you'll see in game design, do I have one here? I was going to say, I have my foldy meeples here. Chad designed these. Chad from Cast Iron Game Lab designed these sitting meeples for me. They're super cool. They don't show up great on camera, but this is the closest thing I have to a meeple sitting here on my desk right now. So a symbol can either be something that is drawn, or a symbol can be a three-dimensional component. So extrapolating from this idea of symbols, everything that we have here from circles to, these are either crowns or frogs. I can see both in there. To these birds. You know, they are bits, they are pieces, but they also have symbols on them that can convey a lot of information. And when you're talking about symbology, it can either be something that is printed on a card, or it can be an actual thing, even a cube, right? Cube is a pretty generic symbol. If you spend a lot of time around board games, you'll recognize it instantly as a very flexible symbol. It can represent resources in most cases. It can even represent a worker. You know, often we will use meeples to be a little bit more directional when something is a worker placement game as opposed to a resource management game. We can communicate that with the meeples, but there's a ton of meaning. I think that's really the core of symbology, right? There's a ton of meaning and shared meaning wrapped up in these bits. Senor Bob mentions symbols on dice. I'm just gonna draw a dice because I'm like, I have so many dice, but they're all in the other room on my bookshelf. So we don't have any here, but it's easy enough to draw. Symbols on dice can be so diverse. I realize that I put the 5. Is that? They add up to 7, right? So, no, that's correct. That is an accurate dice representation. A little skewed on the one side. But you can do a lot with the dice. So you can have numbers. I'm actually going to write that in my mind map here because numbers are symbols. Letters are symbols. They represent something other than themselves. So like the dots, right? You look at a dice face, you have 5 pips on that side. Without the weight of math and science and culture behind this image, this would just be a number of dots. You know, like I have just a bunch of dots, a bunch of dirt, a bunch of rocks, or whatever, a grouping of things, without the knowledge of the language of math. That wouldn't mean anything to me, right? It's just like just a bunch of rocks. If a cat, let's see if I have my cats here. If a cat sees a bunch of rocks, don't know how good cats are at counting, but in general, just be like, hey, there's a group of rocks. But for us as humans who understand math, we see those 5 dots, and it translates into the number 5 and also into the word 5, and it has all this meaning wrapped up in it, which is really cool. But of course, you can also get dice that have other symbols on the side. I've seen a lot of games with really cool custom dice. It's a great way for randomization of numbers, of custom items. Cards can also be used to simulate the same thing, but the nice thing about a dice is it's a nice weighty component. And it's pretty easy to get a dice that is printed with the symbols, but because the small surface area of a dice, you often will have just a symbol more than a bunch of text on the dice. So if we have our little bird here, I'm just going to put that over there, right? You might have a picture of a bird on one side, like a frog, a fish. On another side of the dice, you can communicate a lot with these simple images and simple pictures. Dice, flashcards, lots of different ways you can introduce symbols into your game. Letters, like we have numbers over here. Letters are also symbols, right? It's a collection of lines. You know, if I just draw a bunch of random lines, to me, this is not a letter in my known alphabet, so this doesn't really mean anything. But if I draw a different organization of lines, all of a sudden it becomes a known thing. Or heck, let's just draw, just adding a couple of extra lines to this picture, or, you know, putting, yeah, doing it like that very quickly change the meaning. So it's just interesting to think about, you know, the things that we understand and know as symbols, we recognize them so instantly. Ooh, I like that actually. But it's actually really easy to disrupt a known symbol and make it a not known symbol. And that could represent some interesting gameplay right there, right? Known symbols versus unknown symbols. This is actually something that's been on my mind for a long time now. So when I made And Then We Died, my original inspiration for the game was to see visions, like see noise basically, and have visions kind of grow or emerge out of there. What I ended up doing is just having word fragments on various cards. Like this one might have a TA on the side, might have a CK, OUR. You lay it on top of another card. So these on their own usually aren't individual words. When you lay the cards on top of each other, there might be a KE on this card. So all of a sudden, you take two things that don't have meaning. You know, word fragments still have some meaning because you recognize the letter in there, but you put the two symbols together, plus, and all of a sudden you have a word, it explodes in meaning. You know, there's a ton of context behind something as evocative and meaning as a word, because words are symbols, right? So this idea that you're like putting symbols together to create or destroy meaning, ooh, I'm gonna make a note of that because that sounds pretty cool. Putting symbols together to create or destroy meaning. It also makes me think of a game concept that I toyed around with a little bit, which was a translation game. So I love that I've like looked at the symbols on this pen and I know that they're there, but I'm so used to just opening both sides. Readability. So this is a very interesting concept as well, right? The symbols could be there, they could be meaningful, but there can sometimes be a disconnect in whether someone sees the symbols, whether they can read the symbols, understand the symbols, because you can get blindness to certain things, right? Especially imagine a bunch of signs or like a bunch of posters on a bulletin board, right? You have things overlapping, different shapes, little pieces of paper, I don't know, some circles up there. It's a lot of information, right? The funny thing about seeing information, we have this presumption as humans that when we look at information, we see everything, right? Like if I look at a page, if there's a stop sign on there, if there's a square, I'm gonna like take in all that information. But our brains are doing shortcuts all the time where they're limiting the information that we take in because it's just too much, right? Like everything you hear, everything you see all around you all the time. Just take a look around your room, wherever you are right now. There's just so much information there, and your brain needs to cut down on some of that in order to function. And pulling it back around, symbols actually do a lot of that work for limiting the amount of information that we have to take in. Think about a stop sign, for example. Shape, color. I don't have a red marker, so I'm just going to use a pink one. Yeah, perfect. All right, so what does a stop sign mean? Thinking about a little bit of the meaning of symbology here. There's actually a lot of, you're like, oh, it just means stop, but there's so much information wrapped up in a stop sign. If you break apart the whole meaning of it, right? I can even, what does a, there's just so much tied up in this, it's cultural, right? Because stop signs look different depending on where in the world you are. And it's situational. So a stop sign means if you are in a car on a road and you come up to this, you need to come to a stop. If you are on a bike and you come up to this, you might probably have to stop, maybe not given the situation. If you are walking and you come up to this, you don't have to stop, but it's probably good to do so and look around. You stop for a certain amount of time. There's a reason. If you stop and someone else has stopped, there's all these rules about who goes first. This is a lot of information. And it's also parsable from different directions, right? So if you look at, you know, you're in an intersection, you're looking around at the other directions, you know, you might see the back of the stop sign, but just by the shape of it, you can know that that's a stop sign. So like, oh, they have a stop sign and I also have a stop sign. It's just so much information tied up in the symbols that we use in everyday life. Anyways, that was a little bit of a sidebar, but so let's dig into this idea of having symbols and breaking symbols, I guess. Not completely sure what the mechanics for this might be. Maybe a drawing game. For example, you have an A here. You say like, that's a letter A. This is blah, blah, blah. You can put some stuff on it and still kind of see the letter, see the symbol that's going on there. So it's like, I think that's an A. It's just weird. Someone put some stuff on there. You can do things like rotate it, invert it. If it's upside down, probably look at it and say like, that's an upside down A. If you remove things from it, all of a sudden it's not an A anymore, it's a V, right? And this idea of manipulating and changing symbols. Change the meaning. Senior Bob says, your A now looks like a road extending into the distance. Stop signs mean who has right of way. Senior Bob, who has right of way? And there's an interesting thing that you're talking about there, layers of meaning, right? Who has right of way? Well, what does who has right of way mean? It's like, oh, if you're in certain types of vehicle, who gets to go first? And you break that down even more. It's like, who gets to push their gas pedal to summon, to communicate to their engine that they're going to move forward. And going on even there, it's like, what is a motor vehicle? Like, in order to understand a stop sign, you kind of have to know about the rules of the road and how cars work. And there's all sorts of, you can keep digging down and down, deeper and deeper to uncover layers and layers of meaning. Like an onion. Alright. So going back to our whole symbology thing. So we talked about collecting, shared meaning, changing, evolving meaning, or even destroying meaning. Alright, so what are the different kinds of meanings that we can play around with here? So we've done manipulated letters a little bit. You could have, you know, play around with letters in words. So it's funny, I think about my game, And Then We Died, you're trying to put the word fragments together to make a word. But then you can look at, you know, how much can you play around with words, with the letters in the words until they don't have that meaning anymore. You know, you can still kind of read something like this. If it's a drawing, then it's a purely additive thing. But imagine if these were like little sticks or components that you could lay on top of each other. You could, yeah, if you had little, I'm like, how can I even represent this with what I have at my desk? So you have kind of like an A, right? Laying sticks, directional things down on top of each other. But if you were actually able to move those, you know, all of a sudden you have an H. Or you have maybe a 4, right? Depending on the shapes of the letters. You have kind of a U created here. So if you have more flexible components that you can move around, you can shift these things and change their shape. Change shape. And that's pretty interesting, right? I'm not sure exactly where that's going to go, but I can write that down. Shape changing. Is meaning changing. Sometimes with these design streams, I feel like I'm working through logical exercises or logical puzzles. So if shape changing is meaning changing, then shapes are meaning. I mean, that's a core part of symbology, right? The shape of something is the meaning of that thing. So the shape isn't the thing itself. You think of the shape of a bird, for example, isn't the bird, but the shape can communicate the definition of the bird. Shapes as meaning. And then come back to here. HU. It doesn't necessarily have to be letters. I'm just having some fun drawing things here. I played a game, Second Chance. It was recently published by Stronghold Games. It's a Tetris-y thing. Roll and write, quote unquote. But you're flipping cards to get the symbols you're supposed to draw. The core gameplay is pretty simple, straightforward, but my friend Javion added this thing where when you draw the symbol, you would fill it in with little doodles on there. So I've had this idea of doodling on the brain as well. So you can make a cool, interesting language thing happen here. Things don't necessarily have to be connected. You can change the rotation. So instead of coming down at an angle, maybe it goes up at an angle. Just taking the different components of these letters and playing around with them to see what shapes evolve. I sometimes say that I feel like the Bob Ross of game design when I do these streams. When I do the doodles in particular, I feel even more so. Talking about changing shape to change meaning, also makes me think of some of the exercises we would do in school, right? You would have your O or whatever. Exercises are just doodles when you were bored. So like oops or something, right? You might draw on this. They could be eyes. This could be a bubble wand. And the S could be a snake. So taking something that has one meaning, like a letter, adding on some little pieces to it. Maybe it's a rattlesnake, right? Boop. All of a sudden, it has a different meaning, which is pretty cool. It also makes me think of certain kanji characters. I really don't know enough at this point to speak to it, but I remember back when I took a year of Japanese in college, when we were learning the kanji characters, they all have a lot of meaning baked into them. I remember the symbol for the moon. Maybe I can look that up because it's going to be a lot more meaningful if I can. Moon kanji. Yeah, there we go. So when we were learning Japanese, our teacher was breaking down some of these letters and talking about the actual meanings for them, and it was really cool and interesting. For our I don't know as much about our alphabet and the reasons the letters are the way they are. I know that all written languages came from symbology. The original idea was like you would draw a picture to represent a thing, and the meaning became distilled over time until it's eventually a sound, right? A letter for us is a sound, but it's cool to look at different languages that still use a lot of that symbology and the very rich meaning in the symbols that come back to the words, and breaking that stuff down is really cool. Bobka says, I'm going to go look up druidic runes for a sec. Yes! Oh my gosh. Runes are super cool. I love runes. Have you ever seen Ogham? I don't know what that is. Oh my gosh. Okay. Again, is a huge fan of words, letters, storytelling. There's so much cool stuff to be seen here. Okay, this is, I don't know if there's a game here, but this looks super cool, and definitely want people to check this out if you have not already. So, and I'm learning something really cool here today. I'm not going to read this completely, so that's going to interrupt the stream a little bit, but, oh no, I'm out of paper. Oh my gosh. Oh, this is sad, but also kind of exciting. We've worked through this whole entire notebook. Here's the very first mind map we did on the stream. Yay, milestones, working through a notebook. Luckily, I have another one right here. I'm going to put a little thing up at the top of it. Notebook 2. Our stream is 2 notebooks old. This is very, very cool. Notebooks number 2. Alright, yeah, so this Ogham language. It's a early British and Irish script. Has letters that are all combinations of lines pointing different directions. Oh, so this one's L and this one's F, which is cool with the F because it kind of looks like an F, but also kind of like a modern E. 2, 3, 4. And this right here, the Ogham, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, written language is very interesting because it actually seems more mathematical and less like interesting symbol. Like these shapes are just collections of lines, so it's very everything was very different. It's just like the numbers. This one has 3 lines perpendicular and this one's got 4. So that's definitely a really cool thing to check out. And what I like about this, tying it back to the idea of changing symbols, manipulating symbols to change the meaning, you can take something like this B here, right? Like this is a B. Morse code actually reminds me a little bit of Morse code too, because it's like I have this thing, it's a B, and then I just +1 line going this way completely changes the meaning. I think what I'm trying to get at here is drastically changing the meaning of something with limited changes in the symbol. So, you know, you could draw something. I could draw a tree, right? Like that. It's a tree. And then if I added a ton of stuff to it, I'm going to... Oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing here. It's a cat. I'm drawing a cat sideways, okay? Bear with me. Yeah. So it was a tree, and now it's a cat. Obviously, you can make really big changes to something to make it be something completely different, but it's cool, this idea of changing by degrees and having it be drastically different. So we're looking at this. I'm going to make a note here that this is Ogham. I'll find out I'm pronouncing that completely incorrectly. Morse code has a very similar thing, right? So for Morse code, an E is a single dot, and an A is, so it's shorts and longs, right? E is a short, A is a short, and then a long. So then a dot, dot, dash. I do not know this. I'm pretending by looking it up on Wikipedia as I draw these things out. But that's another cool thing, like adding a small piece to something to drastically change. So small changes, big changes. Like that seems like a very playful thing. It's something that'd be very playful to play around with. Do you know how to read IPA? I don't know how to read IPA because I don't know what it is. Oh, International Phonetic Alphabet. Here's an example of that. Types of language where you can easily change characters. Ogham, Morse code, IPA. I'm gonna make a link here so I can refer back to that and check that out. Senior Bob says, adding modifier symbols. A house symbol could be a house, but a house symbol with a sun symbol could be a greenhouse. Yeah. So we're talking about simple changes. Ooh, yes. Just adding a line. We're thinking about it in a very abstract way, right? So this whole very abstract. This whole direction we're talking about adding a line to something is very abstract. We would probably, unless we were playing with people who knew Morse code by heart or had some representation, Braille. Braille is another great example of this, and something I've been studied and interested to learn more about, because I would love to be able to make some games more accessible with Braille. But yeah, with Braille you can have Braille. I'm actually going to bring this up, posting some links in the chat for further research if anyone else is interested in playing around with this. Alright, so Braille is made on a 2x3 grid where there's a number of dots, and depending on their position relatively within that grid, it will represent the letter. It's not usually drawn with the square around it, but it's easier if you don't know Braille to grok it that way. So you have one dot in the upper right corner. That's an A. I think it's a lowercase a. I'm not sure about casing for Braille, so I'd have to do some research into that. Two dots in the upper right corner, and then the middle right side is a B, and so on and so forth. So to us, or to someone who doesn't read Braille, a very simple, you look at one dot versus two dots, it seems like something that could be hard to grok, but to someone who's enmeshed in this system, it can be a very quick and natural thing. Okay, so we got Braille there. Okay, yeah, so we're talking about adding a dot, a dash, or a line as very abstract ways to modify meaning. Add a dot or a dash. And there's a lot of meaning wrapped up in language that could be a little bit tricky. Potentially something a little more accessible, a symbolic language. Picture of a house means house. I think there's a term for that, but I'd have to look that up. So as game biologist had mentioned, you can represent things, shoot. There's a word for this. It's on the tip of my tongue. But like I have a house here, maybe on a card, because let's come back to the game design thing. So I have a house here, and this means house. Maybe it does a particular action, but if I have the house card, and overlay it with the sun card, all of a sudden these two cards together have a different meaning and a different mechanical function, which sounds pretty cool. Together have different mechanics. I'm going to write that over in our notes here. It's a little easier to see. Each card has one or more symbols. Overlaying them will modify symbol sequence. This is fun too because it ties a lot into what I'm doing with the merge game. And in that one, you combine the cards, you put them face down, so the symbols themselves aren't really put together, but I could see a cool mechanical thing where maybe you're covering up some of the symbols on the cards to even more drastically change the meaning. But if you have a whole like train or chain of cards, I'm drawing that too small. I'm gonna get like a bigger. So I can actually draw symbols. Make a note over here. Train or chain of cards that makes a big mechanical effect. And these cards, I'll offset them a little bit to show that they're laid on top of each other and chained together. And again, coming back does remind me a little bit of And Then We Died. So this could be things very simple, like a house, a tree, a smile, a shoe. Like, do I want to, that's not a bad shoe. And then a sun, right? And even a combo potential here. But maybe there's two symbols on each one. So the sun card isn't covered up, so you have a sun and a raindrop over here. I like this too because it ties back into the whole, if you've been on my Twitter recently, my pinned post is represent your game name in emojis. So we've been talking about different emoji inspired games. And this looks like something that could play around with that. Bobicus mentioned earlier in the chat, or what about a set-like game where number, color, pattern, and shape all matter? You can manipulate up to 24 symbols, essentially. I'm going to post this over here because that's definitely something interesting that I want to dig into. Gameologist said, note to self, watching a symbology conversation on mute ends up looking like people cooking up artwork for a modern rendition of the Michigan relics. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I realize for people watching this on mute, it can get... ooh. Oh, fake relics. Yeah, mute can get a little bit weird with some of our conversations, but that's a cool thing to check out. Because we're talking about symbology, but can also be relics. And again, symbology doesn't just have to be written text, it can actually be physical objects as well. Mabaka said, oh, and have a secret map of symbols to letters, and the first person to form a goal word with their symbols wins. Translation. Lost in translation. Okay. That's pretty corny, but I'm gonna save that. I always like coming up for the title for the videos and streams during it. Instead of Lost in Translation, it could be a game called Found in Translation. So no matter what we're doing here, I think translation is going to be some element of it. Oh my gosh. Game biologist, you're a lifesaver. You're a lifesaver. Pictographic. Pictographic is that word that was on the tip of my tongue that I couldn't think of. Pictographic language. Cool. Pictographic language equals picture represented words. Exactly. Senior Baub, this could be used with transparent cards. Yes, very much so. A couple of weeks ago, we were playing around with sound waves. I know I keep promising to finish that prototype, but prepping for Origins has got me a little backed up with that. But that's another great use for transparent cards. And I would love to make some sort of a transparent card game because it seems like super cool concept. And that would be cool because you wouldn't have to worry only about how things were laid out for this train chain But you could have a circle of ink to block out certain things. And you could have different shapes on the card. So this is, you can kind of see through this, but depending where the card, so there would be opaque regions and transparent regions on the card. And transparent regions on the see-through card. And depending on how you lay the cards on top of each other, I'm just going to put numbers here for the symbols because I got a little small with my doodle there. But then you'd see through. And there might be different numbers on these various cards. You'd be able to see through to certain symbols underneath. Certain symbols revealed and obscured to create a secret code or language. This, with the 4 on here going up to 6, right? This actually reminds me a little bit of the Braille grid that we just drew. So that could be, and then bringing it back again, right? Tying it into some sort of Braille thing could be cool. And all these numbers, they could be houses, faces, whatever, for the secret code that you're trying to create or generate. So we're coming up with some potentially cool components or ways of laying out or organizing components that could make for some fun gameplay. For the actual mechanics or style of a game that this could be, the first thing that comes to mind is Decrypto, but with pictures. So if you haven't played Decrypto, it's smidge of Codenames-esque, because you're trying to give clues to your team without the other team getting too much information out of them. And yeah, you have this cool like deciphering panel that you slip your clues into. You can look at the different words they have to play around and work with, and you're trying to, the opponents are trying to decipher the code as you give it, just using the words that you say that they will write down. But if you could do something like that with images, so instead of being like, so it would be a picture of a house. Instead of having to say house, you would have the actual image of a house. So that could be cool to play around with. Babakis says, divide the card into 4 sections, and each card has a symbol in a specific region. Senior Baum is making some emojis in the chat of that's very adorable, actually. I was thinking lifesaver, like the candy, but we have here, it does look like a person drowning, plus a ring. I would interpret that as lifesaver. If I saw those together, I didn't know it was lifesaver, I might not get it, but after seeing it, I was like, oh my gosh, lifesaver. So Decrypto, but with pictures. Clue giving game. Literal could be interesting, but at that point it becomes more like the emoji game, where it's just like, oh, these mean this, and you're trying to just be very literal about it. But figurative might be cooler and more interesting. Assigning new meanings to symbols. And that's interesting too, because if some symbols have much stronger limited meaning, much more evocative meanings than other symbols. Because, like, yeah, if I draw a house, it's hard to see this as anything other than a house. It can be hard to separate out the meaning from, or the meaning graphically that it gives you from another meaning you might assign to it. If I drew something just like a circle within a circle, that's a more abstract. And that's really interesting to think about too, right? That abstract symbols are, by their definition and nature, symbols that you can assign multiple meanings to, whereas a non-abstract symbol has the meaning tied much more closely to the symbol itself. Game Biologist says, I once did a super rough prototype of a plant ID mechanism tool with a set of cards with punch-outs. Ooh. In grid patterns, they could get overlaid to reveal the plants that had those characteristics. It felt very punch-cardy and ciphery and puzzly. Ooh, I like that. So let's bring all this stuff together. We have the cards in the 4 sections. If it was 4 sections, it could even be a square card, which could be cool. Square. So we have 2 potential directions for this. Square card. 4 quadrants. Different cards have areas. Revealed and obscured. This is for the transparent cards, or Game Biologist's donut or tire or lifesaver for the circle. Yeah, that's a good point, Senior Bob. Sorry, I'll get back to this in a second. But yeah, with the circle, right, it could be someone really excited for a donut. It could be somebody drowning and getting a lifesaver, or it could be someone freaking out because their tire is rolling away down the street where they're trying to fix their tire on a hill. There's a lot of stories that can be wrapped up in this abstract symbology. Can be wrapped up in or the punch cards with some information and some holes where you can reveal layers of information. I'm going to make a quick note, storytelling question mark over here. So when we're talking about the emoji game or the language or the things you're doing, it could be a more loose form, creative, less mechanical thing where you're just trying to arrange symbols in fun ways to tell cool stories. And that could be a fun thing too. I'm a big fan of components that let you tell cool stories, obviously. And Then We Died is just such a thing. Coming back to these square cards, kind of like the idea of the square cards because they can be rotated. They don't have as much of a fixed orientation. Let me see if I can draw out what I'm thinking here. This is a pretty tall stack. If you had cards or maybe cardboard things, you could have certain parts where there's holes where you see down through the stack, and certain parts where you cover up different pieces of that information for the punch card thing. Yeah, that's definitely a component. It's a little easier to construct than to draw. If I actually put it together and started stacking and rotating, I could come up with some cool stuff. And I like the idea of it being interpretive, code-namey, code-wordy. But you could also have this be pretty mechanical, you know, especially if you're to do a larger component, right? And have something here where maybe this is just like, these are surface level, and then these actually go down through, I think I could draw layers there, yeah. Go down through a few layers and worker placement sort of a thing, or your back to mechanical. Stacked cards go down a few layers for worker placement spots or resource generation. So here, I mean, think of something like you would still have the symbology, but you would have like a plant here. So maybe if you put your thing there, you'd be able to get plants. Gold. Or just a generic resource brick. And you'd be able to put your piece there and get these things. But depending on each round, you would have an option to like stack and change the shape of the board and the available options. Options of symbols. And again, it's moving a little farther away from this idea of codes, pictography, language. But that's an interesting branching of the two things that we have going on here. Game Biologist says, if you want to think 3D instead of flat cards, design a folded paper fortune teller with hidden flaps for info. You remember the kind you'd make? It's a cootie catcher. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. In elementary school, where you'd predict where you'd live and how many kids you'd have. Oh, I absolutely do. Actually, shoot, I don't remember where it was. I don't think I got it. I didn't actually get to play the game, but I saw someone pitching a cootie catcher game a few conventions ago. I think it's a great idea for a game. I hope that eventually comes out, because I would love to check that out. Just gonna put in all caps here. Cootie catcher. Alright, I'm actually going to... What size are we thinking here? Like 3 by 3, 3 by 3, 4 by 4. I'm gonna pop over to Photoshop here. Make a new file. Have it be square. I don't know why it keeps hiding layers. I think that's a thing every time you open a file it should do. I'll probably have some weird setting, but yeah. It's been very strange. I should also probably have a template for a square card, so I could have the grids, or at least have the margins in here, so I'm not accidentally overprinting that. This could be cool too with, I actually have a bunch of cardboard pieces from the game boards that I've taken apart, and I could actually print this as a sticker. Maybe 3.5 by 3.5 to fit like 4 of them on a 8.5 by 11 sheet. Yeah. There. Let's play around with this, right? Let's get a nice quadrant grid going on here. And think about the components that we have. Let's get them a little more. I have the margins here, so I think I gotta move these in to get my halfway points accurately. Doesn't have to be 100% accurate. I can always zhuzh it a little bit later on. Just eyeball it. You know, for early prototypes, it's definitely more important to get it out in the world than it is to be perfect. Alright, so got my quadrants there. Make my sweet circles. Hit that up with a stroke. Yes, stroke. 4 is probably enough. Yeah, sweet. Just make a bunch of those. Yes. Move all the circles. Is this gonna center for me? Perfect. So we're playing around with this idea of a component. Again, as I always say, a component is not necessarily a game. Component design isn't even the best place to start for it. But if you, sometimes just having a cool component to play around with can inspire some really cool ideas. So let's switch the view back over here so we can get some noun project going on. I'm thinking house. I don't know why house keeps popping up, but I feel like a house is a very strong, evocative symbol. I don't know what it means yet. What does it mean? Let's do like house and a tree. We get a pine tree going on there. Download them to the download folder. Pop them over somewhere more useful later on, but for now I'll just go into my downloads. Speed things up a little bit. Right, house. Oh my gosh, it's huge. House, why are you so big? Q, we get a house. We will get a sweet tree going on here. All right, so my idea for this, and make sure I still have everything showing up cool. So there would be some, this is for the cardboard punch thing as opposed to the clear see-through cards, because I'm interested to play around with that as a component. We'd have some symbols on each of the card, depending on the shape of the card, and I think I'll just put, because I don't want to fill in the whole thing, so that's going to be a lot of ink, I'll just put a little X for the ones. It's just going to be a cutout, so you'll be able to see through to this. Oh my gosh, again, not entirely sure gameplay wise what we're gonna do with this, but it seems like a super fun component, right? Alright, do we still want to call this found in translation? I don't know. I don't know if this is gonna be the translation game. game design, new, sure. Found in translation. Found in translation cards. Cards, tokens, whatever. Cool. And now we can layer this up, drop all this stuff in folders, print it out. I've got this really cool that I bought on Amazon, like a full sheet sticker. So I can actually print this out and just either I could probably slap the whole thing down if I had a big enough cardboard sheet, which I do have some decent sized ones from all the games I took apart, or do them individually and peel off the stickers if I found I had right size components for that. Senior Bob says, house plus trees equals cabin. House equals family, safety, shelter, wealth, community, construction, civilization. I mean, that is a good point. Let me pop over to back to our design doc. When we're talking about meanings in a pictographic sense, there's definitely the different layers of meaning. And I think that's an important thing from all the symbology that we're talking about today. Even something as simple as like a letter A, right? A letter A means but it also, A is a word, right? So it means like a unit of something, a thing, right? But it's also like a cultural thing, like when you learn language, it's different in different languages. So there can be a lot of stuff wrapped in there. Or like Game Biologist said, for a house, like I see a picture of a house, I think literally it's like, oh, it's a house. But if you're using it to represent different things, which is definitely, if you play around on Noun Project a lot, you start to see some of these evolving meanings. They can mean different things depending on the context. All right, let's pop back over to Photoshop for a moment. Also, if anyone has questions about prototype production, I use Photoshop mostly because it's the graphical program that I have the most experience with. I've been thinking about switching over to an Illustrator InDesign pipeline, which is something that other designers I know do. You have a little bit more control over the graphics of your prototypes that way. You can also lay things out in a bunch of different ways. So it's definitely worth playing around with to see what works for you. This is, even though I'm experienced with it, I still sometimes feel a little slow producing things in this way. I think a lot of a good pipeline for prototyping is something that doesn't, it's not a blocker, right? You want something where you can get something decent as quickly as possible, so you don't have to mess around with a lot of stuff. Like if you have an idea to prototype, the faster you can make that happen, the more likely you are to make the prototype and then play test it, which is of course the most important part. So coming back to this, let's push this component idea a little farther and think of what we might do with these different things. For now, we're going to go in the direction, I hope I didn't put ink on my face because I have ink on my finger. Look on my face, this side. I might have ink on my face. I don't think I have ink on my face. All right, cool. So, yeah. What if we push this components thing. And I'm imagining like we have our stacks going on here of just different regions where these are stacked. Potentially you'll have a big board where you might have printed on it different regions to stack these things, changing the functionality of regions over time depending on the stacking. Functionality of regions over time. We have mechanics now. We don't really have a theme for it. I picked a picture of a tree and a house because I liked those things. We can go in that direction. We can go in any direction, though. I mean, it could be weather control with suns and clouds. Again, it could be generic resources. Gold, brick. Yeah. You could have different resources that you could generate. Get time as a resource. It could be kind of a generic cube pushy type of a thing where you're trying to get iron and wood and make tools out of them. So say it's resource management. What kind of resources would we want to acquire? Alright, I should just use my bullet points. They're a little prettier. Wood, iron to make tools, houses, etc. House, cabin to make the perfect vacation. Bill and I have been talking a little bit about going on vacation. I've been looking at different, for like a short like weekend trip as opposed to like a long big vacation. You could put a bunch of, so I have vacations in the brain. Mountains, ocean, car, for a road trip. Tie into the idea we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, where the tourist attraction one, where we were going across the country collecting different items from different places, food, ice cream, vacation. And if we were to go in that direction, each of these tiles could be a location, putting a layer on the vacation, a destination. So you're building your perfect location. So if we come, oh, sorry, I realized my window's in the wrong place. Come back to my dock where I'm typing all this stuff out. If we come back to the design dock, yeah, let's imagine, let's get an ice cream in here, right? I'd say part of the fun of Noun Project is just like looking at all the different symbols and getting hungry. I'm starting to get hungry, so yeah, there's a good ice cream. So we can actually layer this up just in Photoshop right here. Ooh. Do I want to duplicate the whole group or leave the circles? Yeah. Actually, let's do that. Circles folder. One of the things about making prototypes in Photoshop is thinking of quicker ways to reduce the number of things you have to keep track of. Also, file size. if you've worked with lots of layers and folders in Photoshop, if you put too many in there, you start to slow things down a little bit. So I'm going to make like a base thing here just for the circles. Alright, have a circles folder, put that on the bottom. Nope, not in the seam. Perfect. So I can just have this always be visible, and when I turn off the different things, it will have the different layers. Because I'm always going to have the circles there for these components that we're working on. You don't need to be, duplicating the circles every time. Alright, yes, I got my circles. Now I can duplicate just this layer, turn that one off, and then put like just the ice cream in this layer. Yeah, perfect. Alright, shrink that down a little bit. So if we have, if we have our ice cream here, this layer is not going to have our tree and our house. I'm like, I made a mistake with that X, and now it's going to be harder to move. There we go. There we go. Alright, so in this one, we're going to have 3 X's, so 3 holes, and only 1 visible one. So this could be laid over. Perfect. So for this component that we're working on, again, we're stacking possibly chipboard or even cardboard, large scale tokens on top of each other. Everything with X's is going to be cut out. So it's going to be a hole to actually see the things underneath it. And what's cool about working with layers in Photoshop is you can actually obscure these things to see how it would work for laying them on top of each other. So if we laid the ice cream on the house tile or vice versa, it would look like this. So, you know, it'd start out with, maybe just start out with just the houses and stuff, and then like, I want to add ice cream to my vacation. Then you would be able to see the ice cream visually. Cool. Well, this is becoming more of a, let's pop back to notes. This is becoming more of a symbol organizing and collection game. So we had talked about resources being a place where you would place your cubes and like put it down into the hole, or maybe they're like tall so you can actually get it into the hole, and collecting resources that way. That might be a little bit fiddly. So instead you're making a tableau here. Well, with your stacking. So that's another, we're kind of branching off in 3 potential directions for this game design idea, which I think is really cool. And one of the things I really like about the streaming, or even just the this process, if you're going to do this at home, you can stream it. You don't necessarily have to, but what you can get for being kind of lucid and open with this process is not get too railroaded down in a particular direction for your game design idea. So even just starting with an idea of symbols and playing around with different components, we have 3 potential ideas. And taking a lot of notes, whether you're going to write it down in a notebook or do it digitally like I'm doing here, mostly because that's just easier to stream. Everything you're thinking, write it down, because you never know when you're going to want to remember. Be like, oh, I had that idea for that mechanic that I really want to bring back. So we have a secret code translation game, which I feel like we're kind of coming back, because this one, tile stacking vacation game, it doesn't have to be vacations. Like, that was a theme that literally popped into my head because it was cabins and trees, and it made me think of vacations because that's the mind space I'm in right now. But this could be, maybe that's how you make the codes and you're trying to communicate a message. And then we have the same tile stacking idea with resource management. It's this idea that you would place workers or cubes on the pictures or in the gaps to generate resources, hence resource management or actions. And this is more of a component for probably a broader game, so this could be one piece that fit in, like coming back over here to the notebook of this thing. Like, you start out with your board and maybe it just has, that could be a kind of cool component actually. So we're seeing these quadrants, circles, quadrants of circles, circles and quads laid out. You start with a board, maybe everything is open, everything open, so maybe you have a ton of symbols starting out on this board, or maybe you have mostly blank things, which I like because it's less overhead at the beginning of the game, which can be a blocker. Board idea. Start with a board with a bunch of circles. I'm going to say unlock here. Unlock actions by placing the tiles over time. So you might actually have some sort of, it would be kind of cool if you just had the circles. Like, I'm really digging the idea of this visual graphic idea. But you could also have visual outlines of all the different sections there. Doop. All right, been very focused on the design stuff, popping back into chat and seeing where we're at here. Senior Bulb and Game Biologist have some great thoughts on prototyping. You should definitely read through because I think there's a lot of really important stuff here. Senior Bulb says, I use mostly Illustrator for layout, but trim images in Photoshop. Game Biologist says, I rough out my protos in InDesign now. I used to use a lot of Word Microsoft Publisher. I like that I can easily slide back and forth between Adobe products to create images and do layouts. Yeah, that's definitely a thing. I know it's it's not cheap. It's definitely easier. I think there's a student version that's not as expensive. You do have to do a monthly fee for it. Although I like the monthly fee. Like, I'm old, so I know back when you had to just like flat pay $500 or $1,000 for Photoshop. So I personally like the subscription model. And if it's something you can justify through work, it really does help for the different styles. So I can pop back and forth. Can be here in Photoshop and either do some layout stuff or do like really cool photo effects. I can go into Illustrator if I want to do tracing and more iconography, and then InDesign, either in Illustrator I can lay out all the cards with artboards to have a splash out of all of the different things that all the cards I'm working on, see them all at a glance, or InDesign is also really good for layouts. Email says, and I use Component Studio for cards these days. So much easier to put a rough layout with rules and a spreadsheet to populate it. Ooh. check out Component Studio. For layout. I haven't actually heard of that one. I use a program my friend Chris designed for doing a layout. It's a homebrew thing. It's not officially available for people, although he's working on it. I'm very excited. But I'm always interested to see the tools that other people use for making things easier. Senator Bob says, iron needs a mine and a forge. Ice cream needs snowflakes and a cow. Oh. Yeah, you're getting back to merge ideas now. Like, this goes in with my merge things. Although I like... I just love the graphic image of that, of making ice cream with a snowflake and a cow. Oh, man. And you get, like, little ice cream meeples. That could be super cool. Or just tokens. Just tons of stuff. Just like make stuff, the game. Resource management, the game. GameBall says dialect in some ways acts as a quasi-secret code. Could be interesting to play with some of the concepts from dialect, the game, in a more structured way in a team-based. I've also not heard of that game. I definitely want to check that out because, again, languages and dialects are something I'm very interested in. Cool. So we have this saved. Let's play around with this idea of a board. Yeah. So let's say let's make this bigger. So it's 3 by 3. What if we made it, I'm gonna shift it up, 6, 9. Yeah. So we can start to play around with this idea of having an actual board here. So if we are using these square things that will sit down on top of things, oops. Yeah, what's the best way to move this thing? Probably lock everything else. Yes. Then we can just drag the circles. This new Photoshop, the movement has definitely been, yeah, there we go. Switched up a little bit. Yes, that's where I want it to be. Now, get our new guides, and we'll be able to put squares around each of these. Yeah. All right, and then we'll be able to put a stroke here that will represent where these square tokens we're talking about, where exactly those are going. Right. Always gotta double check I'm on the right layer. Oh, gotta unlock that. Now we can stroke. Cool. Let's hide these guides for a second so we can look at some stuff we're starting to play around with. So the idea is we will have this square token that slots down on things. And all of this stuff is going to be covered up. Maybe start with a few symbols on the board as like the starter set, but be able to play around with the tiles. For example, like this is what the stacking would look like. If I put the house tree tile. I guess there'll be big tiles. I guess tile is probably a good term for it. Down on top of this, like I might have the ice cream one as the one that's already on the board because people like ice cream. And then I'd lay the house tree one down over that, and all of a sudden you would have more regions available to be able to do stuff, which is super cool. Gamebiologist says Component Studio is from JT. Oh, it says from the Game Crafter. Okay. He keeps fiddling and adding new tools and functions. It's $10 a month subscription service. Well worth it for the time saver. Nice. I'll have to check that out. Game Crafter definitely does some cool stuff with producing the components. Bobika says every card has 3 partners and can be played when 2 of its partners are on the field. So like Snowflake, Cow, and Shop are all partners to Ice Cream. I like this partnering tying idea. It definitely seems like there's a lot of fun stuff to play around with there. Cinderbob says the merge thing is something I'm kind of drawn to. Oh yeah, the combining, it's just so visceral and just so natural. It's like shove things together and then like a new thing pops out instead of, because in real life so many things you make, it's not just like you smash, you know, milk and ice together or a cow and a snowflake and it's like I got ice cream. There's all these steps and things and mixing bowls and components you have to bring together. So this idea of simplifying it and just making it be like 2 things, now I get another thing. I think that's a lot of what is compelling about board games. Just the simplification of simplified creation of a lot of things we do in normal life. You know, it's like 3 wood and a brick to make a house. Like how freaking satisfying and easy is that compared to like 300 logs and cement for the foundation and the pipes for the plumbing and the wiring, the copper wires for the wiring, and there's just so much in real life that goes into making these things. The simplification is very compelling and very satisfying. Bob says the pine tree and ice cream makes me think of mint ice cream. I know, right? Except it's pine is a little more citrusy. Actually, pine definitely has a little bit of that, the bitterness to it. I have eaten pine needles before. Not eating, you like chew on them because they have a nice flavor. And there's a lot of vitamin C too, which is good. If you're ever lost in the woods, you can stop from getting scurvy by doing that. You probably shouldn't swallow them because I don't think it's very good for you. Game Biologist says when I was in elementary school, they'd buy those Christmas tree-shaped mint ice cream treats for us sometimes before the holidays. I can still remember the super strong mint flavor. It sounds very tasty. I'm getting hungry again. I always get hungry. I'm gotta work on that. Let's get... As we get ready to wrap up in a little bit here, I'm just gonna build out some of what I'm working on. Build out this board so you can see the evolution of my ideas. It's very real and very visceral in my mind's eye right now. And I realize that what I'm seeing might not be what you're seeing. So that's one of the nice things of using Photoshop for this, because as much as I try and do it with my notebook over here so you can see all these things I'm working on, it can be nice to play around in Photoshop as well, because some of the stuff I can draw super quick and super easily, but some of the stuff, it's faster just to do it in Photoshop. So I like going back and forth between the two of them. It's just kind of fun, satisfying over here. I mean, this is absolutely one of the best parts. Whoops. Of playing around with something like Photoshop, because in the time it would take me to draw a bunch of circles and squares, it would not look, oops, it would not look nearly this pretty. Oh, that's super weird. I somehow made that one bigger than the other one. Probably have to oh my gosh, that's the funny thing that you find from doing this. Like, I made the square here. I made this one like slightly bigger than the other one. But that's cool, because we can just go back, unlock all these, delete a bunch of layers. Yeah, come back to this, because I want them to be a consistent size and shape. Duplicate. And again, if you're drawing it out by hand, it would take a while to fix that all, but since I'm doing it in Photoshop, if I can select things, sure, yeah, there we go. I can do it more quickly. Yeah. Looking good. Knock it down. Duplicate it, select, oops, I locked down too many, down, pull it over here. So you can see this idea that is starting to evolve. We're going to take the square tiles and put them over this blank board. It could start out completely blank too. As compelling as having starter symbols on here is, I also kind of like the idea of starting out with a blank grid, in part because it doesn't leave anything predefined, right? If you do have some symbols, you have the thing of like, oh, these are always the starter pieces that I'm going to work with. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. You know, it's a very interesting question of starting states for board games. I mean, that could be multiple episodes in and of itself, because you have the polar opposite pulling forces, where on the one side you want to give people some information, a baseline, especially if it's their first time playing the game. But on the other side, you're pushing the game in a certain direction by having these starter things. So maybe having the grid board be a starter piece, and then having a selection of starter tiles. So having a blank grid board to start out with, and then having starter tiles that players can choose. What's nice about this compromise is it gets you right into the action of the game, where I'm starting to see action for a game like this would be placing the tiles would be a lot of the fun of it. So it's cool if you get to start doing that right away. And then the question becomes, is there always a best tile to place down that's an auto pick? And if that is the case, then it makes more sense to go back to having that stuff pre-populated, because one of the core concepts of game design is don't make your players do stuff if they're always going to do the same thing. You know, if you're having an opening bid or whatever, and always the bid is always one, then just tell them that. Like, instead of just start bidding on things. I think I've seen it a lot in a lot of the game design that I like, and I see a lot of newer game designs that take a long time to get going, because you're always there's an optimal first move. And if there is, don't let players mess that up by giving them options to not do that. So it's a little bit of diversion into the philosophies into game design philosophy. Senior Bob says, these sessions always go by so fast. I'm glad. That means I'm doing something right. I think if they dragged, that would probably be a bad sign. Gameologist says, first laid tile equals conversation starter. Ooh. I like that. Again, we're still not 100% decided on whether this is going to be a storytelling game or a more mechanical resource thing. That's why I like the idea, why I'm going towards components so early in the design of this, because I think for this particular style of a game, having the components, very unique components to play around with, can push the mechanical design of it, and it'll be very quick to see which one of these is fun and exciting, if any, which one just feels kind of weird and grindy. And I think having the actual physical pieces will be a great indicator of what direction, if any, the game should go. As with any design, all of this is theoretical. All board game designs are, what's the best way to put this? Bad until proven good, I guess. Or I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, you don't know if a design is good, if it's fun, until you've played it, until you've play tested it. So it's very important, if you are a game designer, if you're interested in getting into board game design, to get this stuff on the table, get the physical pieces, start moving them around, start playing with them. The sooner you can do that, the sooner you can find the fun, if there is any fun. And sometimes there isn't. That's a really important thing when you're getting started out with design, or even if you've made a few designs and you're feeling stuck right now, is that not every game idea, no matter how compelling it is going to come together. Not every theme is going to work. I have a whole Trello with all of the different ideas that I'm super excited about trying. And like, not all of them, there's no way that every single one of these is going to become a game. Just pop this over here for a sec. Yeah, just like huge list of all these things. Like pre-ideas is where I just put down the stuff that's not even really a thing. A lot of these come from dreams, where I just see this thing, I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. Ideas are a little more developed, potentially with a rough prototype to them, and then things that are a little more prototyped out. So yeah, I think it's important to approach all of this with a lighthearted, loosery attitude. Games are supposed to be fun, and ideally the process of making games can be fun as well. So don't be afraid to throw something down that might not work. Don't be afraid to work on developing something that you're not sure where it will go. Just get in there. Start making stuff, start playing. I think that's some of the best game design advice that I've ever heard, is just play around with the things you have. And don't be too wedded to any particular design direction. Senior Bob says, getting to the fun in game sooner can be a challenge. It can be a challenge because I think when a lot of people are designing games, myself included, you have this vision of the flow and the process, and in your mind's eye it can appear to be very elegant, and as someone who inherently knows how all the systems fit together because you design them, it can all just fit together so perfectly and make so much sense. So it's like, oh, of course we're going to take turns laying out this movement track because it can be fun. Even those setup parts, like, they can be fun. It's like, oh, I'm putting this here and then I'm going to move along it eventually. But just because it's fun and just because it seems to work really well with what you're trying to do doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be in the game. I learned a lot of this from writing fiction as well. most beginner stories that I see, most that I've written myself, you are really served by just chopping off the whole first third of it. You know, there's a lot of stuff that goes into most games and adds to the complexity and to the setup of the game. If you're finding the process difficult of deciding where the game should start, again, just try it. Like, just start the game exactly in the middle. Just throw players into it and see if it works at all. Probably won't, but you're going to learn a lot and probably find a lot of stuff that you can reduce to get to the action more. And that's one of the things I say most frequently about game design is how can you just dive in there more quickly and get people doing the stuff of the game. That's my favorite quote. I want to do the stuff of your game. This is what I like about it. I want to do that. Game biologist has an idea about warfare game design. Oh, warfare. I think this is a metaphor, or it's like the SAT thing over here. Warfare is to game design. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. No prototype survives first contact with the playtesters. I might have to quote you on that, game biologist. I really like that. That's a good quote. That'll be my flavor quote from the stream. Like, what have we learned today? Your prototype shall not survive. It shall not pass. Cool. This makes me so happy. The symbology, as I feel with most of these streams, I feel very unmoored at the beginning of it. Some go very smoothly and evolve into a pretty solid game idea. Others, like this one, meander around, and I get nervous that it's not going to come together at the end. But then most of the time, it does come together. And just component-wise, I'm very excited to play around with this punch card idea of laying things over. And then secondarily, try the same components, but with the transparent cards laid over each other. And this idea of an evolving grid with different resource opportunities, and just the ongoing idea of symbology, language, translation, stories, recombinations of putting all these things together is really fun and really exciting. And as with everything, I only wish that I had 100 more hours per week to put more of these things together, because I'm definitely focusing right now on a few games. And that's the thing too, right? Where it's always good, make new games, get new prototypes out there, play test. It's a great process. Where I'm right now trying to be more professional about it is honing a few designs so I can bring them to conventions, pitch them there, which means some things will fall off to the wayside. But I'm getting faster at prototyping, and the stream is definitely helping to get all those ideas out there. I have most of what I need already in Photoshop here. As long as I don't get too tied up in what it's going to be and just make something quickly, I can actually get that to the table pretty quickly, play around with it. I just want to bring a bunch of weird stuff to Origins. I don't know if any publishers or other designers would be in that, but I just want to like get more cool stuff out there. I think that's what most excites me about where I am in the design industry right now. Well, I think that's about it for me today. This has been super fun. If you just tuned in recently, I am getting ready to pop off the stream, but you can always see the highlights on this channel if you want to go back through what we designed and what we discussed today. I also put it on YouTube if you prefer seeing videos on there as opposed to on Twitch. Here every Tuesday, except I need to figure out what's happening next Tuesday because I'll be flying out to Origins in Columbus, Ohio, which is really cool board game convention. If you haven't checked it out, definitely put that on your radar. Excited to come back and tell stories about that the week after. Figure out if there's going to be a stream or what's going to happen next week But other than that, you can hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions about what we worked on today or questions about board game design in general. You can also hear me on Ludology, which is a podcast that's been around for 10 years, I believe, but I recently started co-hosting. I'm also on Table Takes presented by Gen Con if you're interested in board game news. As always, you can follow the channel or subscribe if you love what we're doing here, and I hope to see you again soon. Senior Bob says, I'll get there on Thursday at Origins. Awesome. We should totally hang out. But yeah, I will catch you again soon. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you around the table.